Hello again. So to kick us off for today, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, a lady who certainly inspired me a lot over the years. Please welcome to the stage, Sarah Wilson, author and activist.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to be with us today. So first of all, I have to say congratulations on writing your new book. I mean, it's amazing. It feels like, I know there's been quite a story in terms of its creation, because it was going to publish like a year ago, but it really feels like a book of really.
I hate to say it, but you're just cutting out, Lawrence. You should be there. No, you're back now.
I'm back. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the point I was going to make is it feels like a mirror of truth, that you've really kind of held up a mirror to show us some very big topics. What inspired you to write that book on the back? Because I know you wrote another book on anxiety a couple of years ago. What inspired you to write this book now?
Well, the first book, First We Make the Beast Beautiful, was a book that was an inward journey to sort of explore my own anxiety. And that was really relevant. It was a conversation that I felt that hadn't been had. We talk about it within the medical framework, but this book took it out more into a spiritual and a mindfulness and a wellness space and a philosophical space. And of course, I did the circuit. The book sold in South Korea and the US. It became a New York Times bestseller. And I traveled around the world speaking and talking to a lot of people with anxiety. What became apparent is that journey needed to go outwards. What I was seeing was there was an anxiety that was happening out in the world at a global or collective level. And I describe it as an itch. I describe it as this sense that things are not right. There's a lot of fragmentation, polarisation, wobbliness, loneliness. There's a whole range of issues that we were all discussing. And I felt that it was sort of a discussion that needed to be had once again. So I actually strapped on a backpack, headed off into the world for 3 years and explored a whole bunch of themes to arrive at this latest book, which, again, as I say, addresses the collective anxiety that's happening, and I'm sure everybody listening knows what I'm talking about. It's very much happening in the workplace today. I felt a responsibility to take what I'd learned, the stabilisation I'd kind of been able to encompass from writing my first book. I needed to take that out and see where I could head, in terms of addressing this at the collective level.
It's interesting, and in the book, I mean, you cover so many big topics, but one of the topics that you cover is anxiety, and you talk about an anxiety epidemic, and you cover the point around resilience. And I thought that one of the points you make is around how, as younger people, I'd like to say we, but younger people in the world have not developed the skills of resilience, and that's creating a major problem for us at this time when everything is so uncertain.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a nuanced aspect to all of this, because we are very familiar with this notion of an anxiety epidemic. We talk about it all the time, and it's very easy to point to in many ways because the statistics certainly bear out. Now, this was a presentation that I was asked to do at the National Press Club in Canberra at the end of last year. So we are talking pre-fires, pre-COVID, pre-everything else. But I think it's still very relevant. So the statistics certainly bear out. So the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has identified that the top disease burden amongst people under 24 is anxiety, and amongst men it's suicide. So this is huge. So we can't ignore it. Just as I went to go and talk at the National Press Club, Mission Australia and Black Dog published a study that showed that 1 in 4 young Australians now have some kind of mental illness. Okay, so it's up massively. It's up 20% in just 5, I think, or 6 years. And in the US, this was something that I learned just recently, the the life expectancy has dropped 3 years in a row for the first time in recorded history from the diseases of despair. So young people are dying from opioid use, suicide and alcohol abuse, and all related to this idea of despair. So there's a lot of stuff going on there, but when you dig beneath the surface, and I think this is relevant in the workplace because many of the people listening today obviously have a lot of young people working for them, and I think we're very worried about them. What is actually the bigger issue, in fact, when you dig down deeper into the studies, is that there is not so much an increase in anxiety-inducing circumstances going on in the world. I admit COVID is pretty heavy. The fact that it's going to affect young people the most in terms of their job prospects going forward is extremely worrying. However, the bigger concern is our lack of resilience to cope with anxiety. And that's what's been presented as the biggest cause of anxiety, is the fact that we have cocooned ourselves as a society. So what, for instance, technology has done, as just one instance, is that in the last 20 years, most of the technological advancements have been about protecting us from discomfort. They're not solving world peace or making the world necessarily a better place. It's mostly been about protecting us from the discomfort of life. Even just having to wait and wonder how long our takeaway pizza is going to take. I mean, we don't even have to worry about that because there's a little green orb on the app that follows it.
It's true.
Others, right? So we don't even have to wait, and delayed gratification. We don't have to sit in uncertainty in any kind of capacity. Now, what that has done, it's actually protected us from everything except for real life, because real life is crazy uncertain. It's full of inconveniences and annoyances and so on. And so as COVID arrived, and as all of the other what's been called black swans and hyper objects, these massive issues that are bigger than the human emotional capacity to deal with it, we are ill-equipped to deal with what's happening to us. Because this is something, Lawrence, that I find very interesting, is that humans have an incredible capacity to deal with disaster and hardship. And those statistics were borne out with the studies that were done after the London Blitz. It's a really great example. But there's probably not anything too more terrifying than being caught in a bombing blitz in London in the middle of a war, right? However, interestingly, during that time, suicide rates dropped to virtually zero and mental health inpatient numbers dropped to virtually zero. So during a catastrophe, during hard times, humans can actually rise to our greatest selves. But what's happened for our generation and what we're seeing play out at the moment, and that this is what is at the heart of the anxiety that we're all feeling, is that we have lost the resilience to deal with hardship. Where I think I describe it as the scab has been lifted by COVID and everything that's going on, and the economic recession that we're just entering into, and we're an open wound with no ability to protect ourselves. And so I feel the discussion needs to be happening at that level. It's a far more interesting and productive discussion, and it's the one that we need to be having.
No, I agree. And you also talk a lot in your book, which I find really interesting, about some of the drivers. So you talk about the fact that we've become very disconnected as a group of people, and loneliness is a big problem. I can't remember, there was a number of statistics that you spoke about in terms of the how lonely people feel during the course of the week. And I'd love your take on that, in terms of what's driving that disconnection in a time when you could argue that we're more connected than ever before, thanks to social media and devices and so on.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion to be having with an Australian audience, because in fact Australians are some of the most socially connected people in the world. Young people in particular they are in fact, I think, in the top 3. The statistics move around a little. However, we're also experiencing the greatest loneliness. Now, loneliness is an interesting thing to be discussing in the context of a work summit, right? But we know that it has risen to the surface as a major mental health issue, post-COVID, and it will it will go on to to continue as a really major issue. And I think anyone working with people in the workforce really need to be aware of this as they manage people working from home, etc. Again, loneliness is a funny one because it's easy to point to, we can point to statistics that show that I think 20 years ago, 20% of Americans were lonely. Now it's 50% of Americans, and that was before COVID. That was at the end of last year. Similar statistics play out here in Australia. We've got a loneliness minister in the UK, and we've got a coalition to end loneliness here in Australia. However, again, I don't think it's quite tackling the issue here because other statistics from Pew research show that 85% of adults are craving for more alone time. So aloneness and loneliness very much get confused. And one of the distinctions that I make, and I think it's a very good topic to bring in here in this discussion in the context of the workplace, is that what we're suffering from is more of a disconnection from meaningful connection. So we've got more interactions with people, but they're less meaningful. And again, that's the juncture at which we need to be addressing this. And there's a lot that can be done at that juncture. But if we keep talking about people needing more people in their lives, we're not going to solve this issue. And so that's something that I would invite everyone listening to think about. It's a nuanced issue, but it's one that I think we need to be discussing. And so it's really a matter of creating more meaningful interactions. And that's a really great challenge to face as we're all doing this kind of interaction, right?
Yes.
Arm's length interaction. And I'll just bring in a really interesting study. Dr. Vivek Murthy, he's a hard name to say when you've got a slight lisp as I do. Vivek Murthy was the former US Secretary General, and he came out with a book just as COVID hit, the poor guy, called Together, and it's about human connection and the importance of it. And fortunately, many of his points remained current throughout COVID. But what he said is that when we are alone, and isolated from other humans, and something anxiety inducing happens, like, say, an epidemic, what we are programmed to do is go and seek out other people. So when we're hungry, we have an urge to go and seek food. When we're thirsty, we go and seek water. When we are anxious, we seek other human connections. And so that poses a huge problem when so many of us, and we're talking a quarter of Australians, live on their own, and that's something that's really important to bear in mind. And that's a quarter of adults, Australian adults, live in single-person households. So when we're in a shutdown situation, and in Victoria, of course, that is still the case, we are prevented from doing what we are biologically programmed to do, which is to go and seek out other humans in a crisis. And that's the distinction that happened during the London Blitz. What Londoners and Brits saw is that they all came together in bunkers. They all came together as a community, and they were able to actually address the anxiety they were feeling. So that's something that we've got to bear in mind, is that we are actually denied that. So a crisis is actually creating a genuine issue with loneliness, but there are ways that we can address it, and I'll get to some of those tips in a moment, because I know that you're going to ask me some tips at the end of this session.
Definitely, I definitely want to get to the solutions, but there's one other issue that I think it's definitely worth us talking about. And what we've learned, of course, and we hear it a lot, and in the workplace more so than ever, is that uncertainty. Everyone feels anxious because of uncertainty, but in truth, the future's always been uncertain. But I think from a business point of view, the change that we've experienced over the last 6 months has thrown like every rule book out of the window. And when you're a big business, then that's been very challenging. And we've seen companies achieve things like 5-year plans in 3 months, and those types of things, getting everybody working remotely. And there's been some amazing case studies of success. But as a person who's heading HR or responsible for the people functions, what would you advise in terms of how to help people cope with uncertainty? Because in truth, people don't like a lot of uncertainty. And I think now, 6 months since the pandemic started, it's a different feeling. At the beginning, you could argue there was a degree of novelty around it. Exactly. Whereas now we're like way beyond that, and this feels like it's becoming the norm. in terms of it?
Well, it links back to this idea of lack of resilience once again. So we have all these technological advancements that prevent us from having to deal with uncertainty. We are thoroughly cocooned from the uncertainty of life. So we've actually lost that resilient muscle, the ability to kind of be cool with uncertainty. And so the challenge that I think anyone in the workplace with employees faces, not just in terms of making decisions for the business, but also for dealing with this stuff within yourself, because Lawrence, off air, you said, used the phrase that HR teams are now the frontline workers in the workplace. So HR heads need to be able to start to get cool with uncertainty in themselves, and then be able to work with employees and staff with getting cool with uncertainty, building a resilient muscle. So one thing to bear in mind is that Australia is suffering from problems with uncertainty at a very high level. So a Queensland University study found that young people have the lowest ability to deal with ambiguity and risk in the workplace. So they're really struggling more than ever before, okay, than previous generations. Now, the problem with this is that another study by the Foundation for Young Australians found that the jobs of the future will demand 260% more risk-taking creativity. So I just want to emphasise that getting cool with uncertainty and ambiguity and risk, even pre-COVID, okay, is absolutely paramount. And you heard me mention before this idea of black swans and hyperobjects. These are terms that economists are using to describe what's happening in the world. And of course, a pandemic is one such. So a black swan is an economic kind of uncertainty that gets thrown at us. A pandemic obviously is one such. A hyperobject is kind of almost the kinds of issues that we face today in the world that are so large that, of course, we are in the middle of it. We can't stand back and observe it. We are in it. So one thing that I talk to a lot of workplaces about, and I was saying this before COVID, is that we've got to stop thinking that there's going to be a perspective that we're going to be able to take from outside at any time in the future. Because every problem, whether it's the climate, or whether it's capitalism and the consumption bubble that we're all in, they are so huge. And AI, of course. These issues are too big for the human brain to deal with. We're in the middle of it. So we've got to actually be okay with that as well, that we're never going to get an ability to stand back and all the balls in the air will suddenly land and we can go, right, here's our strategy. We're going to wait until we know when the balls are going to land. Because as we go forward, we realise no ball is ever going to land ever again in a nice kind of, table, PowerPoint presentation. We've got to actually get very used to sort of ambiguity and risk and this kind of thing. And so that's the challenge. And some of the things that we can do around that is we can certainly create certainty, what are called certainty anchors. It's a psychological term. So as things get a little crazy uncertain, as you said, humans, we do struggle with uncertainty. The uncertainty and decision-making is engaged with the same part of the brain that controls the flight or fight mechanism. So the more decisions that we have to make, the more we'll overtax our anxious response. So it is important that we dial down and we help our employees dial down the number of stupid decisions they've got to make, like small decisions. So just as an example, we all are aware that a lot of tech people and business people love to talk about a morning routine. That's a type of certainty anchor. What these people are doing, and Obama did it, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, they all refer to this idea of minimising the number of decisions they've got to make in the morning in particular. So they wear the same clothes. Obama wore the same 2 suits for the entirety of his presidency, right? We know that Steve Jobs has a black T-shirt, a white T-shirt, a pair of jeans, and I think he has 7 pairs of each. they refer to this same science, right, around anxiety and decision-making being intertwined. And if anyone's interested in this, you can go and have a look at MIT. Have done a lot of research around this, Barry Schwartz and the paradox of choice, that kind of study. So if you can minimise the number of decisions that your staff have to make and that you at an individual level have to make in a morning in particular, because that's when we tend to overtax our decision-making part of the brain, then that's great. So most successful people have boring breakfasts. That's an observation I think I made in First We Make the Beast Beautiful. Just routinise as much as you can that doesn't matter. So that's one tip I would really advise, is if your teams can routinise the stuff that doesn't matter, it will free your staff up to, A, be less anxious and also make more important decisions throughout the day. The other tip that I would have for people that are dealing with anxious staff who are really struggling with decision making, because the more anxious you get, the less able you're to make decisions. I have a bunch of hacks in First We Make the Beast Beautiful on how to make effective decisions to dial down the anxious button. But one that's really good in the workplace is if you have a staffer who's really deciding between option A, option B, and they're just getting nowhere, they're stalling on it, is to make the decision for them. So actually have them present the two ideas and go, I think what you're trying to tell me is that option A is the better option. Now, if a staffer who's very earnest and taken that very seriously has gone backwards and forwards on an A versus B, both options are likely to be pretty good, right? All they need is somebody just to almost flip the coin and go that one. So some certitude that you can provide to a staffer on something like that will enable them to, it's a certainty anchor. It will enable them to dial down their anxiety and then get on with making that decision the best decision. Because, of course, we know that once you rally behind something, it will become the best decision.
Yeah.
So I talk a lot about that to corporates, is to step in that capacity and help staff make a decision they're struggling with. It sounds very simple, but it's highly effective.
No, I love that. I love that. And it goes back to your point about us or HR professionals really supporting themselves. And maybe, because we've got a few minutes left, and maybe just to finish, I'd love to bring in some of the some of the insights that you shared in your book about forest bathing and going out in nature, because it's such a simple thing, you know, particularly in Australia. We're surrounded by amazing amazing natural world. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about that and share some of those statistics. That would be wonderful.
Well, I naturally walk to dial down my anxiety, and I never really understood why it worked, but it's what I've done all of my life. And so I set out to hike around the world in footsteps of different thinkers to kind of solve this issue of global anxiety or global itches and disconnect. But as it turns out, there's more than 40,000 studies that have been done, predominantly by the Japanese and South Koreans, who have introduced this idea of forest therapy or forest bathing into their health policies. So large corporations incorporate this into their staffers' well-being. In South Korea, they send people off to forests to deal with anxiety in the workplace, children who've got bullying issues, and it's the fix, and it's covered by health insurance. It's
amazing. It's so simple, but so effective. Yeah.
And the studies play out. So just a couple that really, I think, resonate, I think, for people is that the left-right motion, you know, of walking actually is again intertwined around that anxious part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. It evolved at the same time that we got upright. So as we got upright and started walking on 2 feet instead of being, you know, head down on all fours, our decision-making part of the brain, the anxious part of the brain, the flight or fight mechanism also evolved to become the human experience of it. So it's a very old part of the brain. So walking modulates that flight or fight mechanism. So we can actually dial down that frenetic, heightened part of the brain and process whatever stresses we might have. The other really important one is that the walking motion goes at the same pace as discerning thought. So just to bring Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg back in, all of them do what we call walking meetings, where they walk to process. And the biggest thinkers in the world that we respect today, whether it's Henry Miller, Nietzsche, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Winston Churchill, they walked to process deeper thoughts. Now, I think a lot of the anxiety we feel today, the disconnect from meaningful discussion and solutions that we feel today, comes from the fact that we are disconnected from discerning thought. We just don't feel it at the time. So a very, very simple thing you can do is to encourage your staff, especially if they're working from home, to perhaps do a 20-minute walk before sitting down to that very important Zoom call. Make it a rule. Create these moral guardrails. And it's a term that economist or economics writer David Brooks in the New York Times coined. Create moral guardrails, certainty anchors for your staff within the framework that we have to work in now. In Zoom calls, have a moment where you connect at a meaningful level. And, have dopamine fasting experiments with your team. And, I'll leave you to look that up. We've run out of time.
Definitely. We've run out of time. We could talk about this forever, but you've documented all of this in both of your books. So where can people find your latest book, This One Wild and Precious Life?
Oh, look, all bookstores.
All bookstores.
Online, I know that Dymocks and Booktopia, if that's of any help, offer a 25% discount at the moment. So feel free to buy it from them.
Awesome. Well, it's a great read. Thank you for spending time with us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Sarah.
Good luck with the rest of your summit.
Thanks very much. Bye.